In the heart of Kansas, just south of Wichita, stands a wall of concrete so massive it has its own horizon. Today, we know that as the Craft Elevator. To some, though, it's a monument to a tragic June morning in 1998. But before the DeBruce event, before the smoke and the sirens, it was the Garvey Grain Elevator, and it was a world record written in stone. Ray Hugh Garvey was a man who understood the scale of the Great Plains. In 1954, he didn't just want to build a storage bin. He wanted to build a cathedral for the Kansas harvest. They used a technique called slip form casting. They poured concrete 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for months. The forms never stopped moving. The concrete never had a chance to set into seams. What they created wasn't a building made of blocks. It was a single monolithic spine of rock over a half a mile long. At 2,716 feet long, it held the title of the largest grain elevator in the world. It could hold over 20 million bushels of wheat, enough to feed every person in America for 6 weeks, in its amazing 310 silos. For 44 years, this was the peerless princess of the industrial skyline. It was a silent sentinel of the plains, a place where the sweat of the Kansas farmer met the steel of the Santa Fe Railroad. It was the machine that never slept. Until the morning, the machine broke. It was June 8th, 1998. I was in the kitchen that morning. The house was somewhat quiet. My 2 oldest kids were watching daytime shows, and I was standing at the sink making a bottle for my 3-month-old. It was just a normal Monday summer morning ritual. I lived in North Wichita, about 12 miles away. Then it happened. Not just a sound, but a physical boom that hit the house. It shook the ground under us. My head was on a swivel, not knowing what was happening. I watched the kitchen windows rumble in their frames for what felt like forever. I remember rushing to the window looking for a sign of what had gone wrong. But the sky looked the same, just a cloudy morning. Elizabeth came running in the kitchen with a terrified look. I just calmed the situation and finished the bottle. I went to the television. For a few minutes, the daytime programming just kept rolling, but then the interruption came. The news broke through. We all realized at that point the horrific tragedy that had just taken place. There was an explosion at the DeBruce Grain Elevator. Deep beneath the surface of the 2,700-foot conveyor tunnels, a single bearing on a concentrator roller seized. It wasn't a sudden break, but a slow build of friction, heating the steel to a staggering 260 degrees Celsius. In a world filled with fine grain dust, the heat was a detonator. The primary explosion was relatively small, but it was deadly in its efficiency. The shockwave traveled through the tunnels at 500 miles per hour, acting like a broom, shaking decades of accumulated dust off the rafters and into the air. This created a fuel-rich cloud that turned the entire half-mile structure into a series of interconnected pipe bombs. As the sirens began to scream across South Wichita, first responders arrived to a nightmare of scale. Thick, oily smoke billowed from the ruptured bins, the scent of toasted grain hanging heavy over Hoover Road. But the firefighters faced a structural paradox. They couldn't simply douse the flames. Pouring water onto millions of bushels of wheat would cause the grain to swell, potentially bursting the already cracked concrete and collapsing the entire half-mile spine. They were forced to fight a ghost in a maze, entering a structure that was still hot, still unstable, and still breathing smoke into the Kansas sky. The explosion could be felt 15 miles away, and hundreds of calls came into dispatch. As the smoke thickened, the limits of the ground-based rescue became dangerously clear. The Wichita Fire Department's ladders couldn't reach the top of the 200-foot head house, where the blast had turned the upper floors into a jagged, inaccessible cage. To reach the sky, we had to look west. A Black Hawk helicopter from Fort Riley was dispatched, hovering over the scorched concrete to lower rescuers into the ruins. It was a high-staked aerial dance against the Kansas wind, searching for survivors in a structure that was still internally collapsing. But the airflow from the helicopter only made the concrete unstable, even after rescuing one victim at the top of a silo, and they had no choice but to pull back after that. On the ground, Hoover Road became a gauntlet of grief. Families who had seen the plume from their own kitchens or felt it, just like I had, raced towards the elevator, desperate for word of their fathers, brothers, and sons. But they were met by a wall of law enforcement. For safety, the perimeter was locked down. The frantic energy of the site was channeled a few blocks away to an elementary school, which had been transformed overnight into a family command center. In those hallways, the emotions slowed down into an agonizing wait. The wait for names, a wait for hope, a wait for any sign that the giant hadn't taken everything. In the days that followed, the mission shifted from the roar of engines to the meticulous, heart-wrenching work of recovery. Rescuers combed through thousands of tons of twisted steel and pulverized concrete. One by one, the names were accounted for. 7 lives were lost that day, men who simply were part of the Kansas machinery. The dust eventually settled, but the nightmare was far from over. As the days turned into weeks, the search became a grueling, dangerous recovery mission. 6 men were confirmed lost, their names carved into the history of that dark Monday. But there was one still missing in the maze of concrete and twisted steel, in the tunnels below. For 29 days, the DeBruce elevator wasn't just a disaster site. It was a tomb and a recovery zone that tested every rescuer to their core. Because of the millions of bushels of shifted grain and the threat of further collapse, the work was painstakingly slow. The last man lost was finally brought home in early July, ending a month-long vigil for a family and a city that refused to leave him behind. He was the last to leave the tower, and in the silence that followed, we were left to wonder how a structure built for life and harvest could become a place of such profound loss. Once the recovery was over, the silence that fell over 55th and Hoover was replaced by the cold, analytical eyes of investigators. OSHA, engineers, and fire marshals descended on the site to answer the question that haunted every grain worker in the country. How did the world's largest elevator fail so spectacularly? They found their answer in the legs, quote unquote, and the tunnels, quote unquote. They found the seized bearing, but more importantly, they found a system that had become too big for its own safety protocols. The DeBruce explosion became a pivot for the entire industry, changing the way every elevator in America is vented, cleaned, and monitored. If you drive by the elevator today, now known as Grain Craft, you can still see the scars of that day. The structure was eventually put back into service, but it was never the same. It carries the weight of 1998 in every bin. It stands as a monument to the 7 men who went to work on a Monday morning and never came home. It stands as a reminder that in Kansas, the horizon is built on both harvest and heartbreak.